Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today. Tacitus Today, you're a pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about paranoia, how it can come about, the forces that can shape it, how paranoia, to the point of irrationality, can be deeply imprinted and shared within a society, so that some societies have a sort of this ingrained paranoia that's deeply imprinted, ingrained on the national psyche, whereas other societies have little or no paranoia. Now, what got me onto this was the talk about, Vladimir Putin, Russia, they're going to take over Ukraine or part of Ukraine, and it seems inevitable now that they'll prevail in a conflict of which they were always going to prevail in. And what next? So there's this paranoid thing of, well, Putin gets control Ukraine and now he's going to conquer the universe. And some very irrational sort of things, particularly from the countries, or supposedly anyway. I think they're being ginned up by the deep state, propaganda machine here, but where all the countries or places bordering or near to Russia or around that area are supposedly going, well, are we next? It's a massive, voracious machine gobbling up everything in its sight. Now that's simply untrue, and it's a ridiculous assertion. But let's just have a look at, and then to me that's idiotic paranoia. But let's have a look at paranoia and how we can maybe go look at measuring it, or why it exists differently in different places, because there are historical significance here and historical events that have gone to shape it. Now, events do shape us. If we get, I don't know, if when we go to the shops to buy things and the shopkeeper doesn't give us the proper change, then after a while we would become accustomed to the idea we have to be very cautious, super alert, avoid those sort of things, or take measures to prevent that. So you become acclimatized to the environment around you, and this can happen over generations and spans of hundreds of years. If an event keeps on occurring, then it acquires significance, sometimes pivotal significance, in a national psyche. So that's how paranoia can occur over decades or indeed multiple centuries. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And I went with years ago. Went with a relative they went to get like a rescue dog at the dog pound, and they went to go, and there was a dog there that they thought they might like. So the attendants brought the dog out, and this had been so the attendant said, this had been a badly abused dog that had been whipped and And when the dog came out, it was pleased to have some attention, but it immediately sort of rolled on its back. I think maybe a particular tone in the voice or something got me roll its back and just started to urinate and shiver and shake in fear. The attendant said, "Don't worry about that; it'll gradually work its way off." But that's because the dog's been abused. Now you can sort of look at that type of mentality of from a particular society, whether it's a geographical region or a national border or people within a national border, that this can happen there. Now, I first saw this when I began traveling internationally on business, and I've commented on this before, the vastly different levels of social trust that are around the different countries of the world. This I hadn't expected that, or particularly thought about it really, but I hadn't expected it and anticipated it. Again, I'm a fairly young sort of guy, and I'm reasonably trustworthy of the world. I assume people's intentions are good, and I was quite surprised that there aren't that many people really in the world that think that way. And there are different reasons for that, and they're typically historical. They aren't just people who decide they want to be difficult on that day and not trust somebody or to trust them. Now, in the anglo-sphere, the anglo-sphere, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, that's the US, maybe to a lesser extent the US, but certainly Canada and so on. these are remarkably, on a relative basis, remarkably high trust societies as the world goes. The very societies that the globalists are brutally and aggressively trying to undermine and turn them, as they've pretty much done now, from high trust society into low trust societies. High trust societies unite and they're formidable. Low trust societies are broken up into groups and they're easier to control and easier to influence and so on. So clearly that's the globalist intention. But at the time, when I started traveling around on business around the world, the anglo-sphere, the Western anglo-sphere, is very high trust. But why? Why is it that high trust? And the reality is that Britain, although threatened with invasion sort of from time to time and foreign troops landing to help in civil wars and that sort of thing, Britain hasn't been invaded by a foreign power seeking to occupy them and change their lives or anything. Hasn't been affected since 1066, really. Again, not that there haven't been, for example, French troops were helping in the War of the Roses for Henry VII and the Tudor dynasty to take the crown. So there have been foreign troops coming on British soil, but French troops landing in Scotland to help the Scottish and these sorts of things. So it did go on, but in terms of being under threat of being occupied and invaded, occupied, and different governments, taxation levels, things like that imposed, it didn't really happen since 1066. Not that there weren't convulsions in England, there were. For example, the Civil War being one, and the religious Reformation moving from Catholic to Protestantism and so on. That was a convulsion. So there were convulsions, but on a relative basis, Britain was, England was free from invasion. Now there were certainly fears of invasion. For example, during the Napoleonic Wars or the Second World War and that sort of thing, there were genuine concerns about it, but it never materialized. Now, the British had a very formidable navy, which would have and did prevent any attempts at invasion. So the British people or the English people could feel fairly secure that invasion was unlikely. They didn't have to hide their valuables in a hole in the back garden or something like that. They weren't fearful that their property would be arbitrarily seized. And if the government did take property, say coastal property during the Second World War, then they would hand it back afterwards or pay the people for it. So really, there was high levels of trust in government. The government, even before there was widespread franchise, voting, only 10 or 12% of the people could vote. There was still, on a relative basis, high trust in the government and the politicians believing they had a noble obligation to look after the people. Was it perfect? Of course not. But the amount of social trust and the amount of nationalism and the amount of people who are prepared to die for the country, all this sort of stuff, this indicated high levels of social trust. So now Australia was never, invaded, although there were concerns. The Japanese were going to invade in World War II and things like that. So there were concerns and moments of concern, but so Australia wasn't invaded and New Zealand wasn't invaded, and so there's no accumulated paranoia in the way that there is in many other different countries, Canada and so on. So stability, continuity, families that owned property 500 years ago in England and wherever, they can still own it. The contracts and the things that were signed 500-600 years ago are still applicable today. And the list goes on for that continuity. So there's fairly high trust in the law, and that's key, obviously. High trust in the law, contracts, government, the army won't be used against the people, and the police are there as a political force, and the public service is there, and so on. So there's a lot of trust. Now again, the globalists are aggressively whittling this away as quickly as they can, and succeeding so far, incidentally. But that's why the Western Anglosphere had, and again, it's being lost at a fast rate, but why the Western Anglosphere has a very low level of paranoia. Now, while social trust is declining in the Anglosphere West, it's not being replaced with paranoia, at least not amongst the white population. It's not being replaced with paranoia. In low trust societies, typically paranoia and low trust together. They're sort of one is an extension of the other in many ways. Now, coming to other countries and Russia. Now, Russia has been invaded. If you look at sort of the changing pattern of borders and territories and so on in Europe or Eastern Europe, so we can focus on that. You look at Sweden was once a very, in the late 1600s into the 1700s, Sweden was a very dominant power in Northeast Europe, gobbling up big chunks of Russia, and their Swedish armies rampaging the length and breadth of Russia as well. So there was the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania. Poland was always trying to gobble up bits of Russia when they could, as recently, by the way, as 1919, 1920. As soon as Poland was a nation again, they started military action against Russia and trying to grab chunks of land there. Chunks of land, by the way, had many Polish people living in it. It wasn't just some arbitrary thing, but nonetheless. The Kingdom of Poland, Lithuania, I mentioned. The incursions of the Vikings, the Islamic incursions from the Turks. There have been endless incursions, and again, the Mongols, rampaging across Russia. And one stage, Russia was almost a province of the Mongol Empire. So looking at all this, Russia has been consistently invaded and traipsed across for many hundreds of years. And the main threat has typically come from the West. In modern times, the threat has come from Germany, because Germany federated into a nation in the early 1870s and became a very formidable national entity from that point onwards, and clearly the dominant power in Europe from that time. And so in the First World War, the German armies were defeated overwhelmed the Russians, and then when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred and the effectively military and the Bolsheviks campaigned on this when they were the Bolsheviks mentioned this many times in their public speeches that they would end the war, but the terms that the Germans imposed were reasonably harsh, and so the Russian Soviet Union communist negotiator Trotsky strung it out for as long as he could, and then the Germans started to invade again, and so he had to concede the treaty that the Germans wanted. And in World War II, the Germans got as far as the gates of Moscow and, of course, Stalingrad, which many people know about. So, if you look at the amount of invasions that Russia has suffered since 1500, then you're looking at or invasion or substantial gobbling up of land. And even if the land was really not Russian directly, but like Ukraine or Belarus, areas that the Russians thought were kind of their spheres of influence, then Russia was invaded kind of once every 25 years since the 1500s. Now this creates a certain paranoia, and the Russian response to this is we need buffer zones. We need to have a territory that we nominally control, where we have governments there that are friendly to us, but also will kind of do what we say within reason. And so we need these buffer zones. So all the areas around Russia, whether it be into Siberia or whether it be, Ukraine, Belarus, or wherever, the Russian government's success, not just Putin, but successive Russian governments over many hundreds of years, particularly pronounced would be the time of, say, Catherine the Great, but even earlier than that, where this idea of acquiring territory as buffer zones was considered to be just a national policy, just what you did. It's just a way of doing things. And so a lot of the territory and Ukraine and Belarus, the emperor or the Tsar of Russia was considered to be the Tsar of all the Russias. So provinces like the Ukraine were considered to be a little Russia. So it's all the Russias, and all these other provinces, Siberia, all this sort of stuff, they're little Russias. Now, this is something that has stayed with the Russian government to this very day. It's deeply, deeply imprinted on the national psyche. And given the Russians that I've met and spoken to, it's something that it's just a reflex action. Well, we're surrounded by people trying to invade us. We're surrounded by, history has proven that. And look at what what's happening in Ukraine with NATO and all things. See, it's happening again. What's always happened is they're at it again, and we have to stop that. We have to keep these buffer zones in place. And if those buffer zones are threatened, then we should engage in aggressive diplomacy or indeed military action. So it's a paranoia that's not wholly unreasonable. It's become so imprinted that it becomes an emotional sort of haze of a concept, which as soon as certain conditions are met, that's it, it's happening again. We have to respond. Now, it may not be happening again in the same way, and perhaps different solutions may solve it, but it's an example of how paranoia can imprint itself. Now, the response this time to NATO's fiddling, Putin made abundantly clear, if you try and bring Ukraine into NATO, we're going to have to do something about it. So there was no secret about it, and yet the West, with the Americans desperately egging the EU on, the deep state controlled US, desperately egging the EU on, went to confrontation with Putin, deliberately spoiling for a fight, and but their tactic, their game plan's fallen over. They didn't exhaust Russia financially or anything like that, which is, I think, one of their the goals or part of their wider game plan. I think they planned to do this when Hillary, because they just assumed Hillary would win the presidency. I think they planned this to launch this thing while Hillary was president, and because Trump ended up as president, they couldn't do it. So they kind of upped the timetable a bit, and because they were so keen to get going on it, they ended up making clumsy, silly mistakes that they may not have made if they could have moved earlier. But nonetheless, now you look at any country around the world and you see that there's paranoia unique to the historical circumstances. For example, Chinese paranoia, the constant civil war, constant changes of government, constant arbitrary seizure of property, assets, money, valuables, and so on and so forth. So the Chinese have, you can only trust your blood relatives. Everyone else is untrustworthy, everybody. And I found this odd when I was doing business with Chinese, that they, even ones that had been, say, in Hong Kong, for example, they've been under British rule for well over 100 years. They all had this same paranoia and this view that you're out to screw them, but they're going to screw you first, or they're going to get the better of you, and negotiation is where they're going to show you that they're in charge, and it was tiresome and difficult and drawn out, particularly where the volume of business isn't large. I remember dealing with one Chinese outfit where their total buying capacity over the 12 months was probably going to be $100,000. They were a small outfit. They operated in a very niche area, and whilst I didn't want to walk away from the business, it was only $100,000. I mean, and the profit wasn't high. If I had people going to see them, or I had to come and see them on a regular basis, that would blow all the profits. So I wanted to get the deal done quickly. And I said, look, you're not going to spend much money. I know it. I accept that. Here's a very good deal. but I don't want to have to come back here every few weeks to put out fires or bail you out. But to them, no, that's what the whitey honky quilo, white boy motherfucker tells us. But we know he's really fucking us over, and we're gonna show him that we're onto his wickedness and treachery. And oh fuck, guys, really seriously. And the one negotiation, the whole wider family with cousins and fucking nephews and everything turns up, and they're all there for the big negotiation for what's going to be $100,000 over 12 months. I mean, fuck. But to them, it wasn't simply that. It was a battle for supremacy, and they were going to show that they were tough hombres, and completely missing the point of what was really on the table in front of them. To them, it was a power ritual, and to me, it was just a business transaction. Or to white people, it's a business transaction. People came from high trust societies, it's a business transaction. But not so to them when they have an ingrained paranoia. Now, I noticed when I went to Germany, a white country, I first went there, I was surprised. I'd been there as a child, but not as an adult. So when I first went there as an adult, which I don't know, 25 years old, 26, something like that, already having had a decent amount of experience traveling, I was surprised at how paranoid they are relative to, say, Australia or England. Like, they're paranoid. Not that they're paranoid, but on a relative basis, they are. Now, Germany's if you look at, say, even going back to the Holy Roman Empire, and certainly the Middle Ages and the Protestant Catholic Wars, or even before that, the Spanish Empire wars across Germany and through into what today is the Czech Republic and into Poland and so on. Germany's been crisscrossed by, or that province, that area of Europe's been crisscrossed by invading armies for 1,000 years longer. The French Napoleonic Wars were constantly rampaging through Germany, or that wider province. It wasn't an integrated nation in Germany back then, but and that constantly being invaded means that you don't have continuity of ownership. You have periods, decades of arbitrary action by an invading army, just seizing assets, seizing your wealth or your livestock, or seizing your crop, or burning it, or killing you if you don't go, and so on. So there's this constant invading and arbitrary and reckless action by the rule of law. What's that? And this has created an attitude in Germans that they're surrounded by enemies, and they're constantly sort of, almost they're at a permanent state of apprehension that the enemies are surrounding them and going to do them in at any second. And that people from outside, if you're selling something to the people outside, then they're trustworthy and in control. If they're trying to sell you something, then you must treat it with very, very serious levels of suspicion. Now, that's not a universal thing, and on a relative basis, the German business people, particularly the sophisticated ones, are reasonably trustworthy. But they're the ones that were protected in large by when there was invasions. It was more the peasants and the so on that were affected. Not that others weren't, but it was that. Now, when you look at when Germany federated as a nation in the 1870s, they suddenly went from a patchwork of Germanic-speaking provinces into a powerful modern industrial nation, and the tables turned very quickly. So whereas the German states may have lived in terror of French invasion, suddenly as a federated nation, everyone else lived in fear of Germany. They had the power and the army and the military and technical, industrial muscle to beat up on anyone really they wanted to, but the paranoia stayed, but the power suddenly appeared. So if you look at the German psyche, even into World War I, and certainly from the 1870s onwards, we now have this power to destroy our possible future enemies. So we need to subjugate the enemy. So if the Russians were always a huge threat rampaging through Germany. So what we'll do is we'll knock those bums out. We'll slap the French around. We'll kick some ass here and there, and we're good to go. We've never really been in danger of invasion from Britain. So hey, we'll try and find common cause with them. They better allow us the glory of an overseas empire, but aside from that, and so on. So really, the Germans were, well, we need to be the #1 undisputed power in the wider European continent. We now have the power to do it, because if we don't do it while we have the power, we'll get invaded and we'll get pushed around, as has been the case throughout history. So they made a pretty good case, and it's deeply imprinted on the national psyche. So this is paranoia, how it can imprint itself over centuries and over time, and how the Russian view of things, and then the paranoia about the paranoia of Russia, which is an issue today. But if you wonder why are these people sort of paranoid? It's when you come from the anglo-sphere, place like Australia or England, Canada, and so on, you don't appreciate or understand the level of paranoia that are in different parts of the world, because we don't have it. We don't expect. There hasn't been that sort of paranoia here. There hasn't been the reason or the cause for it. And so the unusually high trust societies on a relative basis are often high trust for a reason. Well, one is they're not being invaded every fucking 5 minutes, but also because continuity of systems of government and politics, of law, property ownership, these sorts of things, application of law, has created a system or a scenario of high trust, and those things are lacking in countries that are constantly having to rebuild their structures as a result of invasion and so on. And these are some of the differences. I hope this illustrates some of the consequences and causes of national paranoia. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.